The phone was shaking in his hand, and Han Doo-jin had not noticed yet. He stood at the black glass of the 40th floor with the whole sleeping city beneath him, and for the first time in 11 years the most feared man in the district could not make his own voice obey him. The hour on the desk clock read past midnight. 6 hours. That was what he had left. 6 hours to walk a bride through a chapel door, or lose everything his father had bled to build. Behind the frosted glass, in a shadowed alcove where the cleaning cart lived, Asha Kamau had stopped breathing. She had only come to wring out a mop. She had not meant to hear anything. But the great Han Doo-jin, the man whose name made grown men lower their eyes in the lobby, had just said something into that phone that no one in this building was ever supposed to hear. His voice had cracked. And Asha, on her knees with a wet cloth forgotten in her hand, understood that she was now holding a dangerous thing. What he had said was simple. 3 words, low and ragged, like they had been dragged out of him against his will. I am afraid. The man who owned half the night had pressed his forehead to the cold glass and admitted to the only person he trusted on the other end of that line that he was afraid, and then the line had gone dead, because even that person could not help him. There was no bride. There was no plan. There was only the clock, and it was not slowing down for anyone. Asha pressed her back flat against the wall and tried to make herself small, which was a thing the world had never once let her be. She thought of the locked rooms in her own life, the rent that was 3 weeks late, the little brother back home whose school fees lived and died on the money she wired every month. She thought of how invisible she was in this gleaming tower, mopping floors that men in suits walked across without ever seeing her face. And she thought, against every instinct screaming at her to run, that a desperate man behind glass might be a door. Inside the office, Doo-jin poured himself something amber and did not drink it. His hand was too unsteady to trust. He had walked into rooms full of men who wanted him dead and never blinked, and now a single phone call had hollowed him out. The pact was the thing. The pact his father had signed in blood and pride, the one that said if the Han heir was not wed by the 6th hour of this night, the bride would be chosen for him, and the whole organization would slide into Choi hands without a single shot fired. Across the city, in a study that smelled of old ink and older cruelty, Choi Kong set down his own phone and almost smiled. Kong did not need to rush. Time was doing his work for him. He had waited years for this single night, the night the proud Han boy would run out of road and discover that there was nowhere left to turn. To Kong, this was not cruelty. This was balance. A debt the Han family had carried for a generation was finally, beautifully, coming due, and his daughter would wear the ring that sealed it. In a hall dressed for a wedding that no one had agreed to, Choi Yuri waited like a blade in a velvet sheath. Yuri had been told since girlhood that she would marry power, and she had decided long ago that she would enjoy it. She did not love Doo-jin. She did not need to. She wanted the empire his fear was about to hand her, and she had no patience for the idea that anything or anyone could stand between her and the dawn. The candles burned low. The hours fell away, and the trap waited. Back on the 40th floor, Doo-jin set the untouched glass down too hard and heard a crack. He had run every number in his head 100 times. There was no woman he could call. The ones who wanted his name wanted his throat more, and the ones he might have trusted he had pushed away years ago to keep them alive. He could buy almost anything in this city before sunrise. He could not buy a wife who would stand beside him and mean it, and he was beginning to understand that this was the one wall money had never broken. The door opened without a knock, because only one man in the world was allowed to do that. Jang Min-jae, his head of security, stepped in with his face carefully blank, and Doo-jin did not turn around. They had been boys together once, before the blood and the business. Min-jae had seen Doo-jin take a bullet and laugh. He had never, in all those years, seen him like this, standing rigid at the glass with his shoulders pulled and like a man waiting to be hit. Min-jae closed the door softly behind him and asked the only question that mattered. How long? 6 hours, Eugene said, and the number sounded worse out loud. Min Jae did not flinch, but something moved behind his eyes. He laid out what they both already knew. Choi Kong had men on every exit. Running was not an option, because a Han who ran was a Han who had already lost, and the families watching would scatter like rats from a sinking name. The only way out of the pact was to satisfy it. A wedding, a real one, witnessed and signed before the 6th hour. And there was no bride. And on the other side of the glass, the bride they could not find was crouched in the dark with her heart slamming against her ribs. Asha had heard all of it.
The pact. The deadline.
The empty list of names. She knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind catches up, that she was about to do something reckless enough to get her killed. Her knees ached against the cold floor. Her pulse was loud in her ears. And still her hand found the edge of the cart, and she began, very slowly, to stand. Before that door opens and everything Asha thinks she understands comes apart, let me ask you for one small thing. If a story like this is the reason you are still sitting here, tap subscribe. It is how Afro-Korean Love Tales Hub knows these nights are worth building for you, and honestly, it is the only thing that lets us keep making them. Subscribe, stay close to her, because what walks through that door is going to change everything. For a moment that stretched far too long, no one in the room moved. Eugene turned, and the cold mask he wore for the world slammed back down over the fear, but it was a half-second too slow, and Asha had already seen what lived underneath it. A janitor, in his private office, at the worst hour of his life. His voice when it came was low and lethal, asking how much she had heard, and they both already knew the answer was all of it. Min Jae moved on pure instinct, stepping between his boss and the stranger with one hand drifting toward his jacket, and Asha raised both of hers fast, palms open, her heart hammering somewhere up near her throat. She did not scream. She did not beg. She looked past the broad man with a scar straight at Eugene, and in a voice that shook only a little, she said the most insane sentence of her entire life. "You need a bride by morning. I am standing right here." The words landed in the room like a glass dropped on marble. Min Jae actually turned to stare at her, his hand forgetting its weapon. And Eugene, who had not been surprised by anything in years, felt the floor tilt half an inch beneath his polished shoes. He crossed the room slowly, the way a man approaches something he cannot yet decide is a gift or a blade, and he stopped close enough that Asha had to tip her chin up to hold his gaze. She did not look away. That, more than anything, was what stopped him cold. "Who are you?" he asked, and it was not the question of a boss to a worker. It was the question of a drowning man to the hand that had appeared in the water. Asha Kamau, she told him. She cleaned these floors 5 nights a week, and he had passed her a dozen times and never once seen her face. She told him she was not a fool, that she knew exactly who he was and what marrying him might cost her, and that she was offering anyway, because she had her own clock running and her own people to save. Min Jae found his voice and used it like a warning, reminding his boss in a low, hard tone that this could be a choi plant, a knife dressed up as a miracle, a woman sent to walk willingly into the Han household and open it from the inside. It was a fair fear. It was exactly what Kong would do. Eugene heard every word of it, and yet he could not stop looking at the steady set of Asha's jaw, the way she stood her ground in a room that had broken stronger people, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. He held out his hand to her. Not the gesture of a man hiring a stranger, but the gesture of 2 people stepping off a cliff together to see if the fall might be survivable. If she meant it, he said, then here were the terms. 1 night, 1 signature, a marriage real enough to satisfy the pact and the witnesses, and in return a sum of money large enough to erase every locked door in her life. Asha looked at that outstretched hand. She thought of her brother. She thought of the rent, and she took it. Her hand disappeared inside his, warm against cold, and something passed between them in that grip that neither of them had bargained for and neither would admit to for hours yet. It was only a handshake. It was only a deal. That was the lie they both told themselves as the clock on the desk ticked over and stole another minute from the 6 hours they had left. Min-jae watched the two of them seal it and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut that this night was going to go very wrong before it ever went right. There was no time for hesitation and no time for doubt. Doo-jin moved like a man who had found solid ground at last, sweeping Asha out of the office and through the vast living room toward the private elevator, already barking quiet orders at Min-jae as he went. They needed a chapel. They needed a witness who could not be bought by Choi. They needed papers drawn and signed and made unbreakable before dawn. And they needed to do all of it without Kong learning that the great Han heir had found his bride scrubbing a floor. It was happening too fast for Asha to feel it properly. 1 minute she had been wringing out a mop and counting the hours until her shift ended. Now she was being swept through a penthouse worth more than her whole street, her work shoes silent on floors she usually cleaned, about to marry the most dangerous man in the city for money she could not yet believe was real. Her hands would not quite stop trembling. She pressed them flat against her tunic and made herself breathe, and a small wild part of her wanted, absurdly, to laugh. But Choi Kong was not a man who left things to chance. In his study across the city, a phone buzzed, and a quiet voice told him something that made his old eyes narrow. There had been movement in the Han Tower. The boy had not run. The boy was, against all sense, preparing for something. Kong set the phone down and considered this the way a hunter considers a track that should not be there. If Doo-jin thought he had found a way out, then Kong would simply have to remind him that there was none. Word reached Yuri in the grand hall, and the smile she had been wearing all evening went thin and sharp. A bride. The Han boy had found a bride. She did not believe it, and then she believed it just enough to be furious. Yuri had never once in her life been chosen second to anyone, and the thought that some unknown woman might slip between her and the empire she had been promised lit a slow cold fire behind her ribs. She rose from her chair. If there was a bride, then the bride would simply have to be dealt with. The sedan pulled out of the underground garage and into the rain-slicked night, and for the first time since the office, Doo-jin and Asha were alone. Neither spoke. The city slid past the wet glass in smears of gold. Asha stole a glance at the hard profile of the man she was about to marry and found, to her surprise, that the terror had not left his face. It had only gone quiet. And in that quiet, she saw something she was not supposed to see, the boy underneath the boss, the one who was still afraid. He broke the silence first, which surprised them both. Why, he asked. Why would she walk into the most dangerous house in the city for a stranger's money? Asha did not give him a soft answer. She told him about the brother whose school depended on her, the rent that came due like a fist every month, the way the world looked at a woman like her and decided in advance she was not worth seeing. She was not brave, she said. She was just out of other doors. Doo-jin said nothing for a long moment, but something in him listened. He knew what it was to be out of doors. He knew the particular loneliness of a person the world only valued for what they could be made to give. He had armies and money and a name that emptied rooms, and somehow this janitor had just described his own life back to him without ever meaning to. He looked away first, out at the smeared gold of the rain, and felt the strangest thing loosen in his chest. The car stopped on a rain-wet street in front of a discreet townhouse Min-jae had readied, one of the few places in the city Choi eyes did not reach. Doo-jin stepped out first, scanning the dark street out of habit, and only when he was sure did he let her follow. Inside, a small team was already moving. Papers. Witnesses. A chapel booked under a name that led nowhere. The machine of his power had turned its full weight to one task, and that task was making Asha Kamau his wife before the sky went gray. Asha had made one phone call, and now Kaya Ture came through the door like a small storm. Her best friend and fellow janitor took one look at the marble, the suited men, the dangerous quiet of the place, and her voice climbed 3 octaves. Had Asha lost her entire mind? Was this a kidnapping? Should she be calling someone? And if so, who did you even call about this? Asha grabbed her friend by both shoulders and held on, and the truth came out in a rushed whisper that made Kaya go very, very still. Kaya's hand flew over her mouth. She did the math the way only a best friend can, in about 2 seconds flat, weighing the danger against the money against the look on Asha's face, and what came out of her was a strangled whisper that was half horror and half awe. The man could buy a country. He could not buy a heart that did not flinch. And her Asha, her stubborn, brilliant Asha, had walked in and offered hers like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Kaya decided, then and there, that she was not leaving her friend's side tonight. From across the room, Eugene watched the two women cling to each other and felt something twist in him that he had no name for. He could not remember the last time someone had dropped everything to stand beside him out of love rather than fear or pay. Min-jae was loyal, but loyalty was a debt. This was something else. This was a woman who would walk into a lion's house because her friend was inside it, and Eugene found he could not look away from it. He had hired a bride. He had not expected to be jealous of her friendships. A gown arrived within the hour, deep gold and ivory, and when Asha put it on and turned to the mirror, she did not recognize the woman looking back. The fabric draped over her full figure like it had been waiting all her life to find her. She pressed a hand to her chest. For most of that life, the world had told her in 1,000 small ways that a body like hers was something to hide. The mirror disagreed. So, she would learn soon, did the man waiting downstairs. Kaya fussed with the gold band in her friend's hair and pretended she was not crying. She had known Asha through every hard year, every double shift, every quiet night they had split a single meal between two tired women and laughed anyway. Whatever this strange, dangerous night was, Kaya wanted her friend to remember that she had stood beside her in it. She fixed the halo, stepped back, and told Asha the truth in a thick voice. She looked like a queen. She had always looked like a queen. The world had just been too blind to crown her. When Asha came down the stairs, Eugene forgot the clock for the first time all night. He had been a man drowning in deadlines, and then she appeared at the top of the steps in gold and ivory, and every count of every hour simply stopped. He had stood unmoved in front of priceless art. He had never once looked at anything the way he looked at her now. Min-jae, watching from the side, saw his boss's careful mask come apart and thought, with quiet alarm, that this fake marriage had just developed a very real complication. Asha paused halfway down, because the way he was looking at her made her knees forget their job. She had braced herself for the cold transaction, the businessman inspecting his purchase.
This was not that.
This was a man looking at her like she was the first true thing he had seen in years, and it terrified her more than his name ever had, because terror she understood, and this she did not. She lifted her chin, gathered the gold skirt in one hand, and made herself finish the stairs. Then the clock on the wall chimed, soft and merciless, and the spell snapped. There were barely 3 hours left. Min-jae stepped forward with the hard reminder that a chapel was waiting, and so, somewhere out in the dark, was Choi Kong. Eugene offered Asha his arm. It was a small thing, a courtesy, and yet when she slid her hand into the crook of his elbow and felt the steady warmth of him beneath the fine wool, something passed between them again, quieter and far more dangerous than the first. Min-jae saw it before anyone else. A dark car across the wet street that had not been there an hour ago, its engine running, its windows black. He let the curtain fall and spoke 2 low words into his earpiece, and the easy warmth in the room iced over in an instant. They were being watched. Kong had found the safe house faster than he should have, which meant there was a leak, which meant someone close had talked. The walls of the night drew suddenly tighter, and the chapel was still a drive away. They went out the back. Eugene's arm came around Asha without thought, his body angled between her and any open sight line, and she felt the change in him, the boss replaced by something older and harder, a man who had survived 100 nights like this. They slipped through a service passage to a second car waiting in the dark, and as he handed her in, his hand lingered half a second on hers. "Stay close to me," he said, low. "Whatever happens in that chapel, do not leave my side." She nodded, and meant it more than she expected to. The chapel sat at the end of a quiet lane, small and old, and lit only by candles, exactly the kind of place a man hides a wedding he cannot afford to announce. A discreet officiant waited at the altar. 2 trusted witnesses sat in the front pew. The dawn was a thin gray promise in the high windows. Everything was ready, and the only thing missing was the bride and the boss, racing through the dark toward a vow that had begun as a lie and was, minute by minute, becoming something neither of them dared name. There was no music, only the soft guttering of candles, and somehow that made it worse, or better. Asha walked up the short aisle alone, the gold skirt whispering against the stone, and Dujin turned to watch her come and felt his own steady heart begin to pound at an embarrassing speed. He had stood calm with guns pointed at him. He could not stay calm in front of this. Kaya watched from the pew, with both hands pressed to her mouth. Min-jae watched the doors, and the dawn crept higher in the windows. The officiant spoke the old words, and Dujin took both her hands, and somewhere between one breath and the next the lie quietly died. When it was his turn to say the vow, he did not recite it like a contract clause. He said it low and rough, looking straight into her eyes, and Asha realized with a small electric shock that he meant it. That somewhere in these few impossible hours, the terrified man and the invisible woman had stopped pretending without ever agreeing to. Her voice shook when she said her part. It shook because it was true. And then the chapel doors slammed open. The candle flames bent flat in the cold rush of dawn air. Every head turned, and Min-jae was already moving, his body dropping between the altar and the doors. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray light, then another behind it, and Asha's borrowed heartbeat slammed up into her throat. They had not finished. The officiant had not said the final word. The signature was not yet on the page. The pact was not yet broken, and Choi Kang's people had just walked through the only door out. If you are still locked into this with me, do one quick thing so I know you are here. Drop the single emoji that matches the mood sitting in you right now. And tell me where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them. If you are watching this on your TV, reach over and hit that like button so the channel knows you are in the room with us. Now stay with it because Asha is about to do the one thing Dujin begged her not to. Dujin reached for her, to pull her behind him, to put his own body between her and the danger the way every instinct in him screamed to. But Asha did the thing he had begged her not to. She stepped forward instead of back. She placed herself squarely between her new husband and the woman in the doorway, lifted her chin, and faced Choi Yuri without a single tremor. Dujin's heart stopped. Min-jae swore under his breath. And Yuri, who had expected to find a frightened nobody, found instead a queen in gold who would not move. Yuri came up the aisle slowly, savoring it. She let her cool eyes travel over the gold gown, the candles, the half-finished vow, and she laughed, soft and poisonous. So this was the bride. A cleaner. A nobody scraped off the floor of his own tower. She had crossed the city expecting a rival and found, in her own mind, a joke. The cruelty in her voice was certain and total, because to Yuri this was not cruelty at all. This was simply the truth as she had always been taught it. Asha did not flinch. She had been called less than nothing her whole life by people far less elegant than this, and she had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive contempt was to refuse to wear it. She looked Yuri dead in the eyes and answered in a voice that did not climb or crack. A cleaner, yes. A woman who worked. And in 3 minutes, when the last word was spoken, also his wife. The candle flames did not so much as waver. Dujin moved then, not in front of Asha but beside her, his hand settling warm and certain at the small of her back, and the message in it was unmistakable. Whatever Yuri had come to break, she would have to break them both. His voice, when it came, was the cold one the whole city feared. The wedding would finish. The pact would be satisfied to the letter her father had written. And Yuri could carry that word home to Choi Kong herself. That was when Yuri's beautiful mask slipped. The certainty in her face curdled into something uglier, and she flung out an accusing hand and a threat she should have kept behind her teeth. Did he think a piece of paper would protect this woman? Did he think her father did not have men outside this very chapel, right now, who could make a bride vanish before the ink dried? The threat hung in the candle's smoke. And in saying it, Yuri made a mistake she did not yet understand. Min-jae caught it. Men outside this very chapel. But no one outside the inner circle had known the chapel's location until an hour ago. Yuri had not guessed it. She had been told it. And there were only a handful of people who could have done the telling. The cold suspicion that had been forming in Min-jae's gut all night finally took its shape, and it pointed at someone close enough to break Do-jin's heart a second time before dawn. He said nothing yet. He only watched. The officiant had gone pale, and still, the final words caught in his throat, because no man wants to finish a wedding with a threat of murder hanging in the room. The dawn was climbing the windows. Minutes were bleeding away. Every second the vow stayed unfinished was a second the pact stayed alive, and Asha stayed in danger. Do-jin felt the whole night narrowing to a single point, and he made the call that would decide everything. He turned to the officiant and said one word: finish. The officiant's voice shook, but he spoke the last words, and Do-jin and Asha said the only two syllables that mattered while Yuri stood frozen with rage in the aisle. It was done. The vow was sealed. They were married, truly and legally and beyond Kang's power to undo, and the pact that had been a noose around Do-jin's neck since midnight fell away into nothing. For one bright second, in the candle's smoke, they had won. Asha let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. But Yuri did not break easily. She turned for the doors, and at the threshold she paused and threw one last thing back over her shoulder, soft and certain and far more frightening than her shouting had been. He should ask his wife, she said, why a janitor just happened to be in his private office at exactly the right hour on exactly the worst night of his life. Then she was gone into the gray dawn, and the poison she had dropped began, slowly, to work. It was a small thing, just a question, but it lodged in Do-jin like a splinter. Why had she been there? He had been so swept up in the miracle of her that he had never once asked. A man in his world survived by trusting no one, and now a single sentence from his enemy had reached into the one place he had let his guard down and squeezed. He glanced at Asha, his new wife, and for the first time the warmth in his chest had a cold edge running through it. Asha felt the change in him before she understood it. One moment his hand had been warm at her back, and the next there was a careful inch of air between them where there had not been before. She had spent her life reading the moods of people who held power over her, and she read this one instantly.
Doubt.
He was doubting her. After everything, after the vow he had meant, a single sentence from that woman had put a wall back up. Her joy cooled into a quiet ache. Across the city, Yuri swept into her father's study with the news, and Choi Kong listened to all of it without moving a muscle. The marriage was real. The pact was broken. His daughter had been face down by a cleaner in a gold dress. Kong did not rage the way Yuri had. That was not his way. He simply folded his lined hands and considered the board anew, because a man does not build an empire by losing one battle and quitting. He had another card. He had always had another card. Kong lifted an old phone and made a single call to a number very few people had. His voice was quiet and almost gentle, the way the truly dangerous so often are. The pact was broken, yes, he agreed. But pacts were paper. Family was blood. And there was a man inside the Han house, a man who had eaten at Han tables and bled for the Han name, who had owed the Choi family a debt of his own for many years. It was, Kong said softly, time to collect it. The drive back was nothing like the drive out. They sat at opposite ends of the same seat with a careful canyon of silence between them, each turned to a separate window. Asha watched the dawn break over a city that was not hers and felt the old familiar weight settle back onto her shoulders. For a few hours, she had been a queen in gold. Now she was a question mark in a stranger's car, married to a man who had decided, on the word of his enemy, that she might be a traitor. Finally, he asked it, low and careful. The question Yuri had planted. Why had she been in his office that night? Asha turned and looked at him, and she did not flinch from it, because she had nothing to hide and she was too tired to pretend she did. She told him the plain truth. She cleaned that floor every Tuesday and Thursday. She had been emptying his bin and wringing a mop, the way she had 100 times, and she had heard a man cry out a word she was never meant to hear. That was all. That was everything. He wanted to believe her. That was the dangerous part, and he knew it. Every brutal lesson of his life told him that wanting to believe someone was exactly how men like him ended up dead in parking garages. And yet she had stepped in front of him at that altar. A spy does not put her own body between a target and a blade. He looked at her tired, honest face and felt the wall inside him crack, just slightly, and hated how much he hoped she was telling the truth. They returned to the penthouse as the sun broke fully over the city, and Min Jae was waiting, and his face told them the night was not over. He had spent the drive chasing the leak, the one that had handed Kong the safe house and the chapel, and he had found it. He held a folded paper in one hand and a terrible reluctance in the other. He did not want to be the one to say it. But loyalty, real loyalty, sometimes means handing your friend the knife that is already in his back. Dujin took the paper and read the name on it, and the color went out of his face. It was not Asha. It had never been Asha. The leak was a man named Park, his own uncle's right hand, a man who had stood at Dujin's father's funeral and wept real tears, and who had been quietly feeding the Choi family every secret of the Han house for years to settle an old debt of his own. The betrayal was not at the altar. It was at the dinner table, and it was decades deep. Dujin sat down hard on the arm of the sofa, the paper loose in his hand, and for a moment the most feared man in the city looked like a boy who had just learned the world was crueler than he had let himself believe. He had spent the whole night suspecting the one person who had been true to him, while the wolf had been at his own table the entire time. He understood now why he had been so quick to doubt Asha. It was easier to fear the stranger than to face the family. He turned to Asha, and for the first time the boss was entirely gone, and only the man remained. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, and did the one thing his whole life had trained him never to do. He apologized. He told her he had been wrong, that he had let an old fear use him, that she had given him the truth, and he had repaid it with doubt. Asha stood with her arms folded and her heart aching, and she let him see exactly how much it had cost her. For a long moment, Asha let him stand in it. Then, slowly, her arms came down. She had spent her whole life being the first to forgive, because she was the one with the least power to hold a grudge, and she was tired of that. But this was different. This man had said sorry and meant it, the way he had meant the vow, and when his hand found hers, she did not pull away. The wall between them came down quietly, and what was left standing in its place was something real. And that was the exact moment the phone rang. Dujin looked at the glowing screen and went still, because he knew the number, and he knew that Choi Kong did not call to make peace. He answered it on speaker so Asha and Min Jae could hear, and Kang's quiet old voice filled the bright morning room like cold water. The pact was broken, Kong agreed pleasantly. But he had taken something this morning to make up for it. Something Dujin would want back very badly. Asha understood before the others did, because her heart had already started counting who she loved and where they were.
Gaia.
Kaya had stepped out at dawn to fetch her things alone on a quiet street, and she had not come back. Asha's hand flew to her mouth, and the bright room tilted around her. Kong had not taken a soldier or a rival. He had taken the one innocent person in all of this, the friend who had come only because she loved Asha, and he had done it precisely because it would hurt the most. Something happened in Dujin's face then that even Min Jae had rarely seen. The terror that had ruled him for 12 hours simply burned away, and what was left underneath was colder and far more dangerous. Kang wanted a trade. Kaya for Asha, the wife for the friend, delivered to the old shipping yard within the hour, or the girl would not be coming home at all. Dujin listened to all of it without a flicker, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very, very quiet. He agreed to the meeting. He did not agree to the terms. Dujin ended the call and immediately began giving orders to keep Asha far away from that shipping yard, locked safe behind his men where Khan could never reach her. But Asha stepped into his path and refused. Kaya was in that yard because of her. She would not sit in a tower while her best friend paid for her choices. She was going. He could bring his army and his plan and his fury, but he was not leaving her behind, and the look in her eyes told him that arguing would cost him more time than he had. So they made a plan instead of a surrender. Min Jae spread out what he knew of the old shipping yard, and they built it fast and lean, the way desperate people do. Kang expected a trade. They would give him the shape of one, and nothing more. Dujin would walk in with Asha apparently in tow. Min Jae and a handful of trusted men would already be in the shadows, and at the right moment the trap Kang had set would close on the man who set it. It was thin. It was dangerous. It was all they had, and the hour was already running. The old shipping yard sat silent at the cold edge of morning, a maze of rusted containers and hard sodium light, the kind of place that swallowed sounds and secrets whole. Somewhere inside it, Kaya was waiting, frightened and alone. Somewhere inside it, Choi Kang was waiting too, certain he held every card. He did not know that the terrified man from the phone call had stopped being terrified. He did not know what a man like Han Dujin became once the fear finally burned away. Kaya sat bound on a low crate in a pool of harsh light, and she was frightened, but she was not broken. They had taken her hands, but not her mouth, and she had spent the last hour telling the silver-haired old man exactly what she thought of men who kidnap cleaners to win their wars. She did not know if Asha would come. She hoped, fiercely, that she would not. And underneath the hope she knew her stubborn friend better than that, and so she watched the shadows, and waited. They came in together, Dujin and Asha, walking into the heart of the yard with the cold sodium light falling hard across them. To Kang's watching men it looked exactly like surrender, the boss bringing his bride to the trade. Asha kept her chin high and her breathing slow, the way Dujin had taught her in the car, and her pulse hammered at 140 beats a minute that she would have laughed about on any other morning. Across the open ground, Kaya saw them, and her face crumpled with fear and relief at once. Choi Kang stepped out of the dark to meet them, unhurried, a man who believed he had already won. He spread his lined hands in a gesture that was almost gracious and laid out the trade as though it were a kindness. The wife for the friend. A simple exchange, and everyone goes home. He had built his whole long life on the certainty that everything, in the end, had a price and could be bought or broken. He looked at Asha in her gold dress and saw only a chip to be cashed. Dujin stepped a half pace in front of his wife and said one word.
No.
Not the trade. Not Asha, not now, not ever. He had come to make a different offer, and his voice was very quiet as he made it. Kang had built his empire on a single belief, that everyone could be bought. Dujin had spent 12 hours learning the one thing that broke that belief. A woman had walked into his worst night asking nothing, and a friend had walked into a lion's den for love, and neither could be priced. Kang had nothing left to threaten him with. That was when Dujin played his own card. He called out a name into the shadows.
Park.
The uncle's man. The traitor at the family table. And from behind Kang, the stocky figure of Park stepped uncertainly into the light, because Dujin had reached him first, hours ago, and offered the one thing Kang never had. Not money. Not threats. A way back. A chance to undo a lifetime of quiet betrayal by turning, this one last time, against the man he had served out of fear. Kang's certain face finally, beautifully, began to crack. The yard turned over in a heartbeat. Min-jae came out of the dark with his men already in position, having moved into the shadows long before Kang's people arrived, and what Kang had built as a trap snapped shut around himself instead. Park's testimony, his records, the years of evidence he had hoarded out of guilt, were already in safe hands and on their way to people who could end the Choi family for good. The old man's certainty drained away as he understood. He had brought a hostage to a yard where he was the one surrounded. But a cornered man is a dangerous one, and Kang lunged for the only thing left in his reach, the bound girl on the crate, a final ugly grasp at spite. And before Kang's hand could close on her, two figures moved at once. Min-jae from one side, and Asha, gold skirt and all, hurling herself across the open ground toward her friend without a single thought for her own safety, because some bonds do not calculate, they simply move. Asha reached her first. She dropped to her knees on the filthy concrete in her gold gown and threw her arms around Kaya and put her own body between her friend and the world, and Min-jae closed the last of the distance and took Kang's arm out of the air before it could land. It was over that fast. The man who had ruled by fear for 40 years was held fast in a shipping yard by the people he had so badly misjudged, undone not by a bigger army, but by the two things he had never once believed were real: love and loyalty. Choi Kang did not rage at the end. He simply stood held in the hard light with his swept silver hair gone wild and his certainty gone with it, an old man who had wagered everything on the idea that nothing was real and had just watched two women prove him wrong. The evidence Park carried would do the rest, quietly and completely, in rooms full of people far more dangerous to Kang than any gun. His empire was already gone. He just had not finished feeling it leave. Yuri stood at the edge of the light and watched her father become an old man in front of her, and the cruelty that had been handed down to her like an heirloom finally faltered. She had been raised to believe that power was the only thing worth having, and that people like Asha were furniture. Now the furniture had won, and her father was held in a pool of sodium light, and the empire she had been promised was smoke. She turned and walked back into the dark, and what she did with the rest of her life was no longer the stories to tell. Asha worked the binding loose from Kaya's wrists with shaking hands, and the two women knelt on the cold concrete and held each other and laughed the way you only laugh after the worst is past and not happened. Kaya, of course, recovered her mouth first, declaring through her tears that Asha was officially never allowed to marry a Mafia boss again, not even once, and Asha laughed so hard she cried, and the awful tension of the whole long night finally broke and washed out of both of them at once. Doojin crossed the yard to her, stepping over the wreckage of Kang's certainty, and the last of the boss fell away with every step until it was only the man who reached down and helped his wife to her feet. He had walked into this night the most powerful and the most frightened person in the city. He walked out of it holding the hand of a woman who had never once been afraid of the right thing. They did not speak. After a night like that, the looking said everything the words could not. They walked out of the yard together as the sun came fully up over the city. 6 hours ago, he had stood at a black window believing he had to choose between his empire and his life. He had lost the empire he was forced into and found, in its place, the only thing that had ever been worth keeping. Asha leaned into his side, tired down to her bones and somehow lighter than she had been in years, and the gold light caught them both as the long, terrible night finally, fully ended. The days after were quieter than either of them expected. The Choi name fell apart in rooms full of paperwork and old debts, exactly the way Kang had always feared the loud things never could. Asha did not vanish into a tower and become a different woman. She kept her small apartment for a while, because it was hers and she had earned it, and Doojin learned the way to her was not through gold, but through the simple sunlit mornings she had built for herself long before he ever saw her face. He came to her door himself, no car, no guard, no suit, just a man in a soft sweater holding a cheap bunch of wildflowers like he was not sure he was allowed to. He had married her at midnight out of desperation. Now he was here in the daylight asking, properly this time, with nothing forcing his hand and nothing left to gain, whether the woman who had saved him would choose to stay married to the man, not the boss. Asha looked at the flowers and at the nervous hope on his face, and she opened the door wide. He stepped inside, and she let him, and in the small sunlit room that she had built with her own two tired hands, the man who had once been the most feared boss in the city rested his forehead against the woman who had once been invisible, and neither of them was afraid of anything anymore. The marriage that had begun as a lie, struck in a panic with 6 hours on the clock, had become the truest thing either of them had ever had. If Asha and Dujin stayed with you tonight, comment the one word you are left holding and send this to someone who still believes love is worth the risk.